This is Europe's battle tank of the future, but only on paper right now. The Main Ground Combat System, or MGCS, should boast drones and more firepower than its predecessors, the German Leopard and the French Leclerc.
Germany and France are building the MGCS together, but they've struggled to figure out who is going to build which part. And actually, that makes sense.
Just consider the main gun of the MGCS. One of the partner firms, French company Nexter, has a 140mm gun, the Ascalon. Another partner, German manufacturer Rheinmetall, has its own new gun, a 130mm barrel. Whoever gets their weapon onto the MGCS should have a guaranteed production line for decades to come, giving them an advantage in other markets.
European countries want to work together on defense, but cooperation can be hard. No country wants to disadvantage its own industry. And that is the basic tension that's been undermining European cooperation for decades. The question now, is that changing?
There's a war on Europe's doorstep. Defense firms are flush with cash, and they're poised to expand. Governments, meanwhile, could benefit from the lower costs that come with common production and ordering. And the EU is eager to encourage even more joint projects.
Europe is arguably facing the most serious armed conflict since the beginning of the EU. Can the world's largest single market figure out how to become a single market for defense?
That's coming up on Business Beyond.
The European Union is a bloc of 27 countries in a single market. The goal is fair competition across borders.
So, as a business, you should be able to compete on a level playing field wherever you want in the EU, regardless of national borders. The thing is, national supply chains die hard, and Europe is still crowded with them for defense. Market principles tell us that firms should compete with one another in the absence of trade restrictions, forcing some businesses to give way to others.
But the customers for defense products are governments, not households, and they have other priorities than just price.
The most obvious, national security. Defense is left to EU member states, who decide which capabilities they need and where to procure or essentially order them. And they're heavily invested in domestic companies. Literally in some cases. Many defense firms are either owned or partly owned by the state.
I mean, obviously we're talking here about a sector that is deeply intertwined with national armies, with the national defense strategies.
Guntram Wolf is a defense analyst at the think tank Bruegel in Brussels.
So the single market logic that we have for all the other products, so for cars, for everything, is one where basically there is a market which is a European market. It's not a national market anymore, but that is different for defense products because of the security nature of these products.
In other words, member states are still largely organized around their homegrown defense industries.
That kind of local preference actually goes against the aim of the single market, and the EU does have rules prohibiting it. But with defense, it's different.
A block of text dating back to the earliest EU treaties carves out an important exception to competition rules for defense. Article 346 allows member states to veer away from EU rules to protect their security interests as related to arms and munitions. For example, member states can limit who gets to bid on big defense contracts if they need to move faster, for example, or protect their own defense secrets.
But that makes sense, right? Consider the tender for a nuclear submarine, like from France. No one can really expect Paris to share the specifications for such a sensitive technology. After all, those are state secrets.
But how about a contract to supply turntables? That was a real case out of Finland in 2008, a 1.6 million euro defense contract for record players used for sonar training for naval forces. The Finnish government pointed to Article 346 when one of the companies that lost out sued. The article has since become notorious in the EU. Instead of protecting secrets, it became a way for member states to avoid fair competition rules. Countries can protect their chosen industries, including defense. The courts have pushed back. Europe's highest court overturned the turntable case and has tightened its reading of Article 346. But member states still have considerable leeway.
We don't have a common European security and defense policy so far.
Hans-Christoph Atzpodian is head of the German Defense Industry Association. It lobbies for the country's biggest defense players.
We have governments which are very much oriented in order to support their own industries as a matter of power play, so to speak.
In 2020, Germany put the procurement of key defense technologies under protection of Article 346. That should have been a boon to local industry, but Berlin has become more reluctant to use that exception following recent court rulings. German industry is meanwhile still steaming about a major procurement given to a Dutch firm several years ago, roughly 6 billion euros for 4 new frigates to the shipbuilder Damen.
We have been giving our biggest frigate order so far to a Dutch contractor, which is, of course, in line with the idea of European competition. However, none of the big other European countries having its own naval industry would have done that.
In the end, the costs of 27 separate defense policies and their national preferences add up. EU members spent 240 billion euros on defense in 2022. A recent EU study found the bloc could save as much as 75 billion euros if countries just ordered and procured more equipment together. Cooperation is hardly the norm, however. The EU says less than 20% of procurement is done collaboratively. That's well short of its own goals.
So that means at the end of the day, we have more companies, more diversity in the products than is actually needed from a purely military perspective.
It doesn't help that Europe has underfunded defense in recent decades. So not only is capacity scattered, but it takes a lot of resources just to get that going again.
The consequences of this have become painfully apparent over the past 2.5 years. Just take the production of the 155mm artillery shell. It's a common munition produced by multiple manufacturers across Europe. But at the start of the war, the EU lacked stockpiles, and it lacked capacity to produce more at scale. Brussels vowed to ramp up production, promising 1 million shells for Ukraine by early 2024, but member states fell short.
If you would have asked a lot of experts, they would have told you that this was unrealistic from the beginning.
Terry Schultz has covered the EU efforts to ramp up artillery manufacturing.
So they were coming back from decades of sort of dismemberment of the weapons industry and sort of refocusing of the weapons industry to suddenly needing to create something that they had never dreamed that they would need to produce on such a large scale before.
Another problem is that there are slight production differences for the 155mm shell across Europe. That makes it less likely that any one manufacturer would get a large enough order to cover the costs of expanding production.
And this is something that the manufacturers are saying, please understand our situation. We can only produce the number of shells that are ordered and paid for. So if you don't have governments ordering larger batches, if you don't have them banding together for, larger orders, we can't make them.
With their own manufacturing still ramping up, EU members have increasingly purchased shells from outside nations.
The good news is that things are improving. European capitals are motivated by the war in Ukraine.
Countries are expanding production with support of the EU. More of them are ordering ammunition jointly, and some companies are expanding. But could that start a chain of consolidations? Look at Rheinmetall out of Düsseldorf. It's one of the continent's major producers of artillery shells. It also produces parts for the Leopard, widely considered a standard for main battle tanks. The company's order books are full, and not just from the German government. Profit margins are quite healthy, and the company is in expansion mode. Rheinmetall recently broke ground on a new production facility for ammunition in the German state of Lower Saxony. It also announced plans to build a production line for 155mm shells in Ukraine.
The question is where things go from here. Can a company like Rheinmetall go even bigger, merging with or even acquiring a large prime contractor from another country?
It's a question that even Rheinmetall has been asking. In a recent interview with a German newspaper, CEO Armin Paperger was open to the idea of tie-ups with other European heavyweights, like French-German firm KNDS, itself a fusion of two cross-country firms, or Italian heavyweight Leonardo. Paperga said that if Europe wants to play in a league with the Americans, then there's only one solution. We need a European champion for armaments. But both KNDS and Leonardo are partially state-owned. European governments would have to agree to any fusion first.
I think, yes, Rheinmetall is a potential consolidator, and I think that is also, from my point of view, the recipe. So the consolidation has to be driven by strong entities which have the power to consolidate, but then it needs, of course, the backing from the respective governments.
It's a political minefield trying to consolidate Europe's fragmented defense industry. But if you can't beat your rival, or in this case acquire them, maybe just join them.
For decades, some of Europe's biggest defense companies have been trying to work more closely on big-ticket military platforms, like tanks, aircraft, missiles, larger programs that can take decades to come to fruition and are often subject to big cost overruns. When member states procure alone, it's often more expensive and it risks duplicating work across the EU. One assessment from 2017 found that Europe had almost 6 times as many different weapon systems as the US, the product of so many national programs.
It's not new. We've been kind of discussing this for decades.
Tim Lawrenson is a consultant in the defense industry and an analyst at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Britain. He says the problem with joint projects is that past efforts often haven't gone well. Some have been almost disastrous.
Lots of corporations have either failed to even finish or delivered product that has been either the product's not great or the product's actually not bad, but the cost of getting there was really, painful.
Procuring together should allow countries to spend big together while keeping costs low for each individual participant.
Sometimes just it ends up being the reverse. It costs you more.
Take the A400M Atlas made by Airbus. It's a heavy lifter for military personnel, goods, and vehicles. A group of European countries turned to Airbus to make the Atlas based on each country's wish list. But costs ballooned. Nations considered exiting the program early, and Airbus wrote off billions in fees.
It's now in service. Maybe it's not a bad aircraft, but it cost an absolute fortune to get there. You'd never do it that way again.
Then there's the Eurofighter. The combat jet is a joint project between the UK, Spain, Germany, and Italy. It now has nearly 700 aircraft on order, a positive sign, but it also had a difficult birth. The UK later calculated that the cost per unit had risen a whopping 75% from original plans.
These programs basically have one thing in common. They've all struggled to balance the requirements of the various stakeholders. And in the case of the Eurofighter, it was difficult to divide the work in such a way that everyone thought it was fair.
And that's a problem also faced by the MGCS, our battle tank from the beginning of the video. Both sides have needed years to come together on a division of labor. Ultimately, the German and French defense ministries had to get involved. In April, they formally signed off on an agreement, though it's still unclear who gets the cannon or if that's even been decided.
You start with, do we have a really common view on what the requirement should be? Do we have a need? Does it look similar enough that we could actually come together? They're not necessarily identical, but we could sort of bring these things together.
But there are also success stories in joint projects. MBDA is a missile consortium run by prime contractors out of the UK and Italy, as well as the pan-European firm Airbus. It came about through a hodgepodge of European tie-ups and acquisitions over more than 2 decades. What sets it apart? Corporate governance. The board of directors are appointed by each stakeholder, but they're widely seen as working together on behalf of the company and not their parent countries. MBDA's products, missiles like the Taurus and the Meteor, can be used on multiple platforms across Europe.
And MBDA is the most consolidated defense company in Europe, by which I mean it's gone further as a cross-border company to try to avoid ending up, as you so often do with these so-called single companies, to try and avoid the duplication.
MBDA is a good example of what the EU wants, a truly fused company that serves multiple end users. Brussels has been incentivizing joint procurement for decades, with not very much to show for it. Now it has new plans that go further than before.
Brussels has earmarked 2 billion euros between 2022 and 27 to help cover some of the costs of joint programs. It's also set up new measuring sticks. By 2030, Brussels wants defense trade within the EU to rise to 35% of the total value of all defense spending. It also wants member states to procure at least 40% of military equipment collaboratively by the same year. Analysts say that while that commitment is a step in the right direction, it's still not enough money. And another hitch, the EU plan also leaves out the UK, traditionally one of the continent's biggest defense partners.
And the question is, will that finally break the logjam? Will it really change the paradigm that cooperation becomes the norm? Or are the barriers to cooperation sufficiently big that still won't be enough?
Let's say you wanted to build a European defense industry from scratch. It probably wouldn't look like what we have right now. Maybe you would have a better division of labor. Say the French could build airplanes and the Germans could build tanks. But again, that's not where we are right now.
The EU is trying to create a more streamlined industry out of one that's still quite fragmented. And countries are spending more, ordering together, and encouraging more cooperation. Defense firms are growing and looking to expand. But until they break through political hurdles, they'll struggle to make the biggest headway.
That, of course, leads back to a bigger fundamental question. Can the EU ever create a single defense policy? Can 27 different nations ever create a single defense policy?
One thing is clear. The war in Ukraine has given the continent new motivation. How far will that take it?
That's all for this episode. We thank you for watching. We'll see you soon.